Hello and welcome to the Western Europe podcast. My name is Antonio, and today I'm gonna do a follow up on the last podcast I did, in which I talked about this book called The German Car Industry My Part in Its Victory by James Rupert. So, last time I talked about a little bit of the story of the writer, of which he talked a lot about in the book. But now in this final chapter, he centered himself more in the story of Volkswagen, which is one of the most successful car companies in Germany. So in this final chapter, he talks how this company, which set the gold standard for cars for lots of years with the Volkswagen Beetle, and he talks about how they started to plummet because they made this amazing car which was air cooled and had an engine in the back and was a very, very successful car, the Beetle car. And because of this, they settled a little bit in this car. They started to they stopped their upgrades, and they stopped investing in more designs. So they wanted to do something new because they saw everyone else going forward with what they started. They inspired a generation of car makers. And last podcast we talked about this. We talked about how all these other companies and how every country in Europe had their version of the Beetle, and well, they got stuck. They got stuck with the Beetle, so they wanted something new. They wanted something that was fresh and solved all the problems that the Beetle had. Because even though the Beetle was a very nice car, the Beetle had problems like space in the inside for passengers. It didn't have many space for luggage, and having the engine at the back made it very unstable. So they wanted to do something different. And at the beginning, they started with the Volkswagen 411. This car was a lot bigger than the Beetle, but still had the engine at the back and was still slow, and it had a lot more luggage in the front, and it had a lot more space for people, but it had its struggles too. And the main problem was that it didn't sell as well as the Beetle, because in all of its life, it sold 1.8 million units, which it's not inconsiderable, but it's a failure compared to what the Beetle sold. So they turned to they started by the design. So they realized that the design was key in selling cars to people in the 1970s. So what they did was send a guy from Volkswagen. They sent him to an auto show, and in these auto shows he saw 6 cars that were his favorites, and these 6 cars were the favorite of many of the, I forgot the name, and it was the favorite of many of the, how do you say this word in English? The favorite of all the, it's going to come to me, but it was the favorite from everybody. So these 6 designs were the favorites of everyone, and he saw a constant in these 6 cars. It was the designer. This designer called, here's the name. This designer called Giorgetto Giugiaro, who was an Italian, who was working for the most famous Italian brands, and he had his own design firm. So Volkswagen tasked him they tasked this guy with the mission of designing a new car for Volkswagen. And they started with the K70, which was a failure and only sold 211,000 units. But it was their first car, which had a front engine and had front traction, had a lot more space for people in the inside, and in the back it had a lot more space for luggage. But it was a failure because of its design. So they built their first Passat on their own without the help of Giorgetto, sorry. And the first Passat was a success because it was a big car, which was an estate car. It had a lot of space inside for passengers. It had a lot of space for luggage. It had a front engine. It had everything they wanted, but they wanted something better, something more stylish, and something that would sell everywhere and to everyone. So this is the point where they sent Giorgetto. They gave him 6 months to design a car that was based on the Passat, but that had everything they wanted, that it was more stylish. But since they only had 6 months, this was very few time to design a car. And they also had to another mission for this car was to export it to the United States. So with this in mind, they had to take into account a lot of other important aspects of exporting a car to America, which was in the form of regulations mostly, because at the time the regulations in Europe and in the United States were very different. So accounted for this, they had to flatten the front of the car, and also because of the time, they didn't have time to design these very stylish rectangular headlights, so they had to stock with the round ones that ended up making it to the car in the rectangular front of the car. And even though these circular headlights ended up being a very iconic part of the Golf, at the beginning it wasn't what was intended by the designer Giorgetto. And this was mainly because of time. They had to use the headlights that they had in stock, but ended up being a very cool design feature that even nowadays is iconic of the Volkswagen Golf. So after these 6 months, Giorgetto had exclusive, and he had everything at his disposal to design this car. He even had a private plane that he could use to commute from Germany to Italy every time he wanted or needed to go to the Volkswagen headquarters to get something approved or sort out something with the engineers. And yes, this last part of the book talks a lot about this, about how Volkswagen first made something very special and very important to the auto industry, but they sank into it, and how they, with the help with an Italian designer, came out of it, and how the Golf was their go out of this situation. So yeah, after 6 months, sorry, this name is very difficult. Giorgetto and Volkswagen came up with the Golf, and it became what it is today. The Golf is one of the best cars in the industry, and it's one of the best cars in history. And many journalists, many auto journalists will agree with this. And yeah, I think that's it. The book ends in describing how they came up with the Golf design and how they managed to pull it off. And I think that will be it. And what I take from this book and this story is how important it is to as a country know your strengths. And it is a very inspiring example how Germany, after 2 world wars and depression and being split in two, they managed to grasp to the car industry and made it their stone, and they set an example for the world. And even then they had their struggles, but with the help of all, with the help of Italy, this brand managed to make again one of the best cars. And this is a very special and important message to everyone, that even if you have the best in your house, you always can improve it. Even if it's perfect and everyone is copying you, you have to look forward, and you cannot always do it alone. And that's what they did, and that's what I take from this story and this book. And I thank you everyone for listening to this podcast.